The idea that I want to present is that the human imagination can represent the world, and it can do that because human beings are a mimetic species, and that animals may well have an imagination that is closely related to ours, but it doesn't have these special representational properties. It isn't immediately obvious that this should actually be the case, because imagination in its raw animal state is actually inseparable from ordinary action and perception. If you think about it, you look at something directly, and the things that are around, you know they're there, but they're peripheral, and your knowledge of them is in a sense imagination. At any time, it's easy to show that most of what you see is imagination, and that there is no sharp distinction between focal perception and peripheral imagination, and still more peripheral, I can imagine the other rooms in the house, and yet they're continuous with my immediate experience. The whole world is linked to my direct imagination. And yet, if imagination is to represent, they've got to be two quite distinct things. Imagination is just an extra dimension of perception. It's what gives perception its intuitive depth and understanding. You look at things around you and you know instinctively how they feel, where they are, what their properties are, what might happen with them. Perception isn't a kind of inner image in the mind. It's a direct imprint. The mind, when we perceive things, interacts. It's more like exploring the world with the hand. The hand fits the world. Sensory motor perception fits the environment. We're embodied and embedded. We're embedded in the world. We don't mirror it. We're part of it. And if one needed any objective proof that imagination and perception and action were all linked, you only have to do one of these MRI scans of the brain, and you see that if somebody is doing something and if they're imagining doing it, exactly the same brain areas appear to be involved. Or if you imagine looking at something and you really look at it, the same areas light up. There's no separation there. It's the same brain. It's just one is a repressed version of the other. So given that we're immersed in the world in this way, how is it that our imagination can separate itself from direct engagement? When we look at other people, for example, we know implicitly their feelings. You don't see their expression. You don't work out that they're feeling or they intend to do something. You see it directly. And we do that mimetically. It's because we have this emulative perception that goes straight to the other person and experiences them in the same way that we experience ourselves. Similarly, when I do something, I know what it looks like. I have an image, or if I wish to, I could imagine my own action as it appeared. Now that imagination of my perception, or my feeling of your feelings, these are separate. When I do that, there's clearly a logical distinction. Because I'm mimetic, I can see feelings and feel things that I see. And that separation is the separation on which our imaginations come to represent. As I said when I was discussing representation before, there are various criteria that it has to meet. Not just separation, but also representations have to be replicatable. They have to be copyable. It's an intrinsic property of representation, like DNA copies or the B language is copied. So thoughts, if they're going to represent, have to be things that could be copied. If you have a thought, it has to be a recognizable, distinct thought that you can have again. It's a necessary part of representation that should be so. If our thoughts are always about what we call intentional actions. Now, an intentional action or an intentional perception is one that has a definite end point. If you're doing something, there is a goal, there is an object. If I look at something, I am looking precisely at an object. There is an end point to that looking, or an end point to that action. That defines the thought or the representation in time. When I look at something, or when I point it out to you, we can both look at it, and I can see you seeing the thing that I see. Similarly, if I do an intentional action, you can copy it, you can imitate it, because we're mimetic. And therefore, an intentional action or an intentional perception is something that exists for me both in my own action and in somebody else's repeating of the same thing or looking at the same thing. You know, we all want to share perceptions. We do it all the time because it's only by sharing them that they become intentional and they become things that we can actually think about. We can repeat them in our minds because they've already been repeated in the world. We've seen different, they have a substantial nature which comes from their existence in the space, the social space, rather than just the brain space. Intentional actions are recognized. We cognize them in two different ways, that is to say, as someone else does them and as we do them ourselves. It's having these two aspects makes it a little bit like the two strands of DNA. They correspond and each one can be generated from the other. It's important to realize that not everything that we do or see is intentional. There are things that we do in passing. There are things that we imitate without ever realizing that we're imitating them. They're things that aren't intentional, but they're things that are ways of doing things or ways of seeing things, things that lead up to an intentional point, but as it were we take for granted. Like when your accent, you don't intentionally speak in a particular way, and yet you've imitated it from other people, but it's not in an intentional action. It's a way of doing something and a way of seeing things. And our life is full of stuff like that. They're not cognitive representations that we can think about. They're what I called in my earlier talk collective representations. They are reproduced in society, but they're reproduced below the level of conscious reflection. But that's just the background. We're interested now in intentionality. It's separate, it's replicatable. In order to count as representation, it must also be regenerated. In other words, you must be able to get back from the representation to the thing that it represents. When you've been thinking all these intentional thoughts about what you're going to do or what you might see, at the end of it, you have to be able to, as it were, cash that in. In other words, you have to perform a real action that was represented. You have to be able to seek out the thing that you imagined, or in some way make real the imagined thing in the real world. Or at least that has to be a possibility. The last one is the reproduction of the whole representational system. It has to be reproduced over time. Well, it is that my system of thoughts, as it were, regenerates my system of behavior, or my system of the things that I do consciously, my role in society or my way of life. All of that is reproduced along with my way of thinking about it and regenerated by my way of thinking about it. And the whole thing fits into a whole way of life, a social way of life, of which it is part. And particularly for the thoughts of our ancestors who could not yet speak, are all basically social thoughts. The idea, the intentional acts that are reproduced and played with in the mind and combined in the mind to think up new ways of doing things and new approaches. It's creative, but the elements are all elements that exist out there in society. Because remember, the stage that I'm talking about now is our ancestors who could not yet speak. Their imagination represented the world, even though they didn't have a representational language. And they differed from us in some very important ways. The most important was that they had no subjectivity. They did not know that they had thoughts. They did not know that they had experiences or sensations. They thought they did these things, but they couldn't reflect on the fact that they did them. They were, in a sense, still embedded in the world, who couldn't stand back and think about, they could stand back and think about themselves as social beings, but not as thinking beings. For that they needed language, which I will talk about in the next one. But it is difficult stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah,
For God's sake. It took a while to figure it out.